Well, welcome to this chance episode of one of my dialogues, and precipitated by the fact that yesterday morning I found myself inundated with WhatsApp messages from various friends of mine saying, had I heard that Mavuso Msimang had resigned from the ANC? The reason they were doing that is because they knew that I have got to know him over the last 4 years as a friend and somebody who I've frequently gone to as an elder of sorts to seek what wisdom he has to offer me in the complex situations that I'm dealing with people being badly treated, essentially whistleblowers who are experiencing retaliation for speaking truth to power. And Mavuso is one of those guys who's sought to try and speak truth within power, within the caucus of the ANC. We've had some rich conversations because he's been a man who's shown immense sense of principle. One of the people that got hold of me was my cousin, Catherine Collingwood, who knows Richard Pithouse well. And she said, well, why don't you have a chat to Richard on your program? So I thought, well, why not? So that's why I have now invited Richard to chat with me about the significance and relevance of the resignation of Mavuso, as somebody who is a keen observer and interpreter and analyst and academic and journalist and writer. He was the founder of New Frame. Unfortunately, that's had to fold, and there's been this huge, unfortunate vacuum in our media as a result. So welcome, Richard, and maybe if you want to just say a little bit more about yourself.
Thank you. It's good to be here and to reconnect. I'm not sure what people need to know about me. I mean, as you said, I've worked as an academic and as a journalist. I've also been involved in politics my whole life since I was a teenager, but more from a kind of bottom-up sense of what politics can be.
You've always been someone that's tried to keep your ear to the ground and try and hear and assess all the competing claims for truth from the perspective of those who are really marginalized and the most vulnerable. Now, that's why, I'm always eager to listen to people like yourself, because as a social worker, that's supposed to be what we are, mandated to do. We don't have often the same sophisticated conceptual and research insights that you've had, because the media as it stands at the moment does tend to follow a very oversimplified narrative.
I think our crisis has multiple dimensions, and that kind of predatory, corrupt element in and around the ANC is central to it, but it's not the only one. There are other parts of that crisis, and one among many, is, I think, the real serious inadequacies of much of our media at the moment. I don't think it's a small thing. Part of it does relate to some of what we spoke about before we were having this conversation, which is the question of corruption. I mean, I've got a book up there. It's called Black Reconstruction, written by a brilliant American scholar, W.E.B. Du Bois, in 1935. It's about the period after the end of slavery, when there was a political process put in place called Reconstruction, which was a democratizing, enabling political process. It was just lampooned, mocked, denigrated, its reputation destroyed ultimately by constant reporting on corruption. Now, corruption is an absolutely key thing. What it is stealing from the people. And it needs to be exposed ruthlessly and relentlessly. But when that's all you do, you see, Du Bois said that undermined the legitimacy of Black rule in the South after the Civil War, after emancipation. And I think to a significant degree, that is what has happened here. A kind of monomaniacal reporting of corruption without a wider context has so delegitimated the ANC and the state that we start to see these very strident claims, or sometimes they're not even claims. They're so self-confidently, assumed that they're not even made as claims. They're just assumed as reason that, business should be running things, NGOs should be running things, but also a return of a kind of discourse of civilizational superiority on the part of the West. So, you don't have many people claiming whites are superior, but you have absolutely, implicitly and explicitly have fairly relentless claims about the superiority of Western civilization, which is a way of saying, in a way, the old things that can no longer be said.
Thanks, Richard. That gives a nice sense of, where you're coming from. I was reminded of who had said that there's no view other than from a viewpoint. What I respect from you is that you seek to look at it without trying to claim to be black and poor, to try and say, look, I'm using my relative privilege and education to ensure that at least there's some sort of opening up of that particular channel, which is, of course, what I've also tried to do. I mean, I can't undo the fact that who I am, a beneficiary of what you describe, Western civilization. At the same time, I have a keen sense of my ethical accountability to actually not just simply be complacent within that. Because initially I was really very encouraged when I heard that Mavuso had resigned. Because as I say, I've got to know him for a while, and I know his daughter, Sazonke, quite well too. We worked together 20 years ago in the United Nations system. She was with UNAIDS, I was with the World Health Organization. So we were, in fact, only two of South Africans in this whole crowd of people from the UN system that were working on the humanitarian crisis in Southern Africa. She had basically given up on the ANC, a decade or more ago. Her concern was that if we tried to save the ANC, it would be at the expense of South Africa. And she had basically walked on it, whereas her father still was trying hard to stay in there as a voice of reason, of conscience, of accountability, given where he had come from and the sacrifices and the struggles that he had made. Interestingly, as somebody who was, relatively speaking, privileged in the context of South Africans. His father and his grandfather were actually quite of the aristocracy of the ANC. I mean, his father was one of the founder members and actually wrote the code of conduct for the ANC when it was founded in 1914, and was a lawyer trained in England and who served and came back to South Africa. His uncle, Mavuso Msimang, was one of the founder members of the Liberal Party. So there's been this sense in which he's a person who himself had been, relatively privileged in that context. He even told me an interesting fact, which I didn't know, that one of their ancestors fought in the Battle of Asantlawana. Now, I thought, goodness, tell me more. He said, but not for the Zulus, for the British, and who ought to have got a Victoria Cross, but was denied such because of the racism that still prevailed. So I'm still looking forward to having a conversation with him more to unpack all that in its own context. And then he also told me that he grew up on a farm near Newcastle, and their neighbors were an Afrikaans family. And he said his grandfather and this white Afrikaans farmer were very collegial and supportive to each other. And the story he painted was like completely contradicts the narrative of this rigid separation, all the rest. So he had come from a non-racial consciousness that had emerged, a belief and a commitment to the best traditions and British justice, the lawyers and their family, etc. And then, of course, when he got back from exile, I asked him, I said, why didn't you go into politics? He said he made a conscientious decision not to actually allow himself to be sucked into that. He wanted to be a servant of the people, a civil servant, and then proceeded to basically distinguish himself in the various roles that he's played with Sandparks, Home Affairs, and, was really a guy who got things done, and has then had to watch this draining of idealism, the commitment, the capacity, the integrity of the party. So I almost feel like a sense it must have been extremely hard for him because of all the investment that had been made in trying to build let's call it a civilization or a civil consciousness within our political institutions that he's just seeing evaporate because of corruption. What was your initial reaction when you heard of his resignation?
I mean, it was all over the media in the morning. And I've never met him, but I've always had a sense of a person of real and serious integrity. And it struck me as a principled position, one that wouldn't on its own have the power to really change much. I mean, people who are predatory in their way, that there's a predatory faction in and around the ANC, are not swayed by moral arguments. But, something like that possibly could help to be clarifying for people who are somewhat in between, people who still have hope but are not themselves rotten. It seemed like an act of a principled man. And, if you read a novel like Ayi Kwama's The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born, there's just this pervasive sense in that novel. It's about the crisis of post-colonial society. There's this pervasive sense of rot, like the actual smell of decay. And it sort of clings to everything and to everyone. And, people just increasingly find themselves compromised. I mean, you get that in some of Salman Rushdie's work too, from India. So when someone is not compromised, when someone is clear, takes a position, takes it publicly, it's very refreshing and encouraging, and it means there's still that space to be ethical and not just to get sucked into the whole morass. So I suppose that would have been my initial assumption. Having said that, and I don't want to be dismissive or to seem petty, but I did also think when I read it, that when I read the statement, there's nothing in here that the World Bank wouldn't be comfortable with. He talks absolutely correctly about the damage that corruption does to ordinary people. He talks about people being impoverished and being kept impoverished. But he talks about impoverished people as victims, not as actors. There's no sense of linking up with grassroots struggles against corruption. There's none of that. And it's part of a broader, that statement, the way it's framed, is part of a much broader phenomenon in which our social and political problems are largely reduced to the question of corruption. And thinking about how we can have a better society is largely reduced to the question of dealing with corruption. You see this very, very commonly in the media. And it's become so much a sort of common sense that often people, they just assume it. Corruption is a massive, massive problem that we face. And there is no way of resolving our problems without dealing with it. But it's not the only problem that we face. And how you deal with something also matters. There's increasingly a very technocratic, but also anti-democratic response to the crisis. Now, he's not taking that position in the letter, but he's certainly not positioning himself in opposition to it either. So I had mixed thoughts.
Thought came to mind because I'm busy rereading Rian Malan's book, My Traitor's Heart. And what came to mind, he talks about the resignation of Van Zyl Slabbert from Parliament. Because Rian Malan, for those who don't know his story, which I found quite interesting, he returned to South Africa in 1985, having been in exile. And in a sense, like you, had tried to sort of find his way back through this jumble and confusion of having been out, trying to get to an authentic voices, to also having to deal with one story after the other of terrible murder and kind of crime and all the rest. He says, soon after I came home, the PFP's leader resigned, saying that he had begun to take himself for granted. In an explanatory statement to the press, Frederick van Zyl Slabbert likened himself to, quote, one of his mantelpiece music boxes that people dust off from time to time and listened to with a quaint nostalgia, close quotes. Under the circumstances, the PFP appeared to have become less a choice than an evasion. That's been thinking about that one. And he goes on to talk about what options we had, in terms of the political options, the black consciousness, the charterists, etc. I wondered, what do you think about that as a parallel? Because after all, with the benefit of hindsight, what Van Zyl Slabbert did was establish IDASA, and worked hard to ensure that people like Mavuso Msimang could come home from exile, gave footholds to the UDF and the ANC, more stern footholds in a democratic process that led to the transition. Now we can sit and critique what happened subsequently to that, and I have been myself at times debated with friends of mine like Paul Graham, who then worked and took over IDASA, and Richard Calland and that, to say that, why did you change your name from Institute for Democratic Alternatives to the Institute for Democracy? As if we had now achieved democracy. And the critique I was having of that was, what about the alternatives still? Are they now simply assumed not to be? We've got there. Look what's happened. We can understand that, there was an amazing miracle in the story about how things were. We did seemingly come back from an abyss. And can we not make the case that Mavuso Msimang resignation is in some ways equivalent because of the expectations that are now riding on it? And maybe it's, what can we do to ensure that we actually get pulled back from this abyss that we are trembling on the edge of? I mean, I think of Judith February's wonderful piece, which she recently wrote about the dystopian nature of our politics. Is this not a possibility that this inverted political system, which is just like sheer madness, could have some sanity injected in it?
I wish I could agree with that. I mean, asking if there's a parallel or some resonance with Van Zyl Slabbert's move, there was a similar sense then of the country on the verge of some kind of precipice. Van Zyl Slabbert, also a person of influence, a person who knew people, a person of high intelligence, a person who, within his own moral framework, had integrity. There are lots of parallels. I don't think Mavuso Msimang is a leader in the popular sense of the term. He's a respected person in society, but he's not a person who has a popular following. We must be mindful of that. Van Zyl Slabbert was an elected leader, obviously of a very marginal white political party, but he still had some kind of following. For me, this is interesting because there's a parallel in a different way to the one that you're imagining. And, Msimang hasn't just resigned. It's not a move from the ANC into what in South Africa people love to call the political wilderness. It's one of the cliches of our politics. It's a move into an attempt to build another political project to take power. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it's one that is backed by white capital. Not that white capital is an homogenous thing, but the people who are backing it are very, very powerful and wealthy white people who made their money in that way. Mm. And I've been told, now I haven't confirmed this, and you'll have to forgive me and your viewers if it's not true, but I think on fairly good authority that the economic policy for this project is going to be produced by Anne Bernstein from the CDE, Center for Development Enterprise. Roger Jardine is on the board of that organization. They take a really extreme right-wing position on economic questions. Mm. Extreme. I mean, the kind of thing the World Bank might be a little nervous to adopt in some cases. And we know what the consequences of that have been all over the global south when structural adjustment programs have been imposed on countries. We know what it's been in the north when austerity has been imposed. And Bernstein has been the fellow of the National Endowment for Democracy, which is, the kind of arm of the US state that is used for certain aspects of the work that need to be done when they're doing coups. And there's a very good book published in 1996 by a guy called William Robinson. It's called Polyarchy. It's a study of how during that period of transition where, Van Zyl Slabbert became a protagonist in South Africa, but it was global, the transition from authoritarian to democratic states, to liberal democratic states. There was a huge project, often US funded. National Endowment for Democracy played a big role in it, in taking aspirations for much deeper forms of democracy, much broader forms of democracy than those permitted by standard liberal democracy, and kind of channeling them into these much, much more limited conceptions of democracy. You'll remember the UDF, would speak about things like people's power. Their vision of democracy was, that there should be democracy in communities. The trade union movement wanted democracy in the workplace. You'll remember that period, the 70s and the 80s. And the NED, which is really notorious for these kinds of things, was one of the key funders of IDASA. And IDASA is a classic case study in this literature on how US funding was deployed to try and reduce what democracy could be, but also to reduce the scope of what it would be able to have, what forms of democratic power would be able to do. Most importantly, to remove economic matters from democratic decision-making. So you could say that, South Africa was in a stalemate. MK had never even met the SADF in battle, let alone defeated them. The uprising at home, mostly in the urban townships, had not defeated the apartheid state, nor had it been defeated by the apartheid state. We needed a breakthrough. We had to compromise. And that kind of tunnel that organizations like IDASA and others could construct enabled us to move through it, and it's better than it would have been if we hadn't. That's a legitimate argument. But you could also say that the reasons for our deep, deep, profound crisis now, a crisis that is inevitably, unless something kind of miraculous happens, going to get a lot worse in the coming years. It's going to get way, way worse, is in part because we had a limited form of democracy after 1994. And we demobilized the forms of popular organization that had really challenged the apartheid state. We did, in the sort of classic move of the post-colonial state, what Frantz Fanon called sending the people back to their caves, and let politics really, in a day-to-day manner, become a matter for elites. And that this is part of the reason why there's such alienation from electoral politics now. I mean, these figures on the number of young people who have no interest in voting are staggering. Now, if you take that view, then the link between Msimang's move and Van Zyl Slabbert's move is kind of tragic, because yes, there's principle, but there's also, and I would argue that this is definitely the case, a deeply, deeply mistaken sense of how we should respond to this crisis. Because to move into a project that is essentially a project of some white billionaires who want to use their money to buy political influence, and to do so in a manner that is going to be deeply reactionary and dangerously reactionary on the economic front, poses all kinds of risks. Look, the best outcome of it from my perspective is that it'll just be another fiasco, like when Mampili Rampili, briefly joined the DA. And it could well be a fiasco. It's not like Herman Mashaba or John Steenhuisen or any of these other actors are in the, Moonshot Pact or the IFP. None of these organizations are welcoming this. I don't think it's been thought through by the funders. I think it seems like there's a lot of hubris and arrogance, and we all know where that can lead. I mean, it's Icarus, So it might all just fall apart. But if it doesn't fall apart, we have the problem of a deeply reactionary, dangerously reactionary political force with $1 billion budget, legitimating itself on the basis that it's not corrupt. Now, we have to oppose corruption in every possible way. It's an absolute threat to society. But we have to be mindful of the fact that politics that just says it is opposed to corruption and has no positive social program, no positive social vision, it doesn't organize people around that vision, has very frequently ended in absolute bloody disaster. So in Brazil, Lula, we now know unfairly, was relentlessly accused of corruption by the media. And what is the outcome of that? It was Bolsonaro. What did Donald Trump say before he got elected? Well, he said many things. I mean, he said many appalling things, but one of them before he got elected the first time was that he was going to Washington to drain the swamp. When you say the political class is corrupt and that everything is rotten and the state is rotten, it creates very fertile ground for demagogues, opportunists to come with this language of cleaning up. That's part of the reason why I think the media has failed in this moment so wholly, because they are setting the ground for the state to be delegitimated as a social actor. But also, when you reduce a complicated social set of problems to corruption, you open the path for something like that, even if inadvertently. What's the alternative? Is the alternative extreme neoliberalism backed by white business? Clearly it's not. But I'll make one more point. Look what happened in Zimbabwe. You had a viciously repressive, corrupt, authoritarian, nationalist movement in power, impoverishing ordinary Zimbabweans, responding with just brutal repression to anyone who opposed it. A political movement emerged out of, or at least in relation to, the trade unions. I'm talking about the MDC. Now, when a movement comes out of trade unions, it's going to have some political credibility of its own. You know, it's going to have a base, but it can also claim to represent ordinary Zimbabweans credibly. I'm not an expert on the history of the MDC. I don't have any detailed knowledge, but my understanding, and I stand corrected on this, is that very quickly, two forces came to support the MDC because they didn't like ZANU-PF. One was the white farmers who were doing things like taking their farm workers in trucks to meetings and so on. The other was this network of NGOs and donors, Western NGOs and donors. Now, what did that do? It immediately enabled ZANU to say, this is a front for white interest at home and abroad. What are the authoritarian nationalists in the ANC and outside of the ANC going to say about this? They're going to say it's white monopoly capital. They're going to, if it's true that Anne Bernstein is doing the economic policy, they're going to say this is a counter-revolution. Okay, there's not one counter-revolution. The corrupt people in the ANC, Zuma, they are one kind of counter-revolution against the political project built in the 70s and 80s by ordinary people. But this project, a businessman backed by billionaires, white billionaires, around an incredibly dangerously reactionary project in economic terms that is legitimated by the fact that it's anti-corruption, is another kind of counter-revolution. And people saying that will not be wrong. So if this does get any traction, if it's not a fiasco, as I think it probably will be, what it's going to do is create a fundamental political division in the society, like happened in Zimbabwe, where it will be seen as illegitimate, not as a legitimate form of democratic disputation. You'll have a kind of Manichaean split, which will legitimate new forms of authoritarianism. And ZANU won. The MDC did not win. ZANU won. The cost of that is for ordinary Zimbabwean people. You know, ZANU and the people around it continue to be rich. I mean, Zimbabwe is just devastated. I think the people backing this, including Mark Hayward, who has played an incredible role in our history, and you mentioned your own role in this, and, you know, Mavuso Msimang, and a whole lot of people, that moment of crisis around, you know, the access to treatment for HIV and AIDS. If Mark is involved in this, he's also making a massive, in fact, for both Hayward and Msimang, I would say this will be the biggest political mistake of their lives. And if it turns into fiasco, it might be forgotten. It might be a footnote in the obituaries when the time comes. If it's not a fiasco, the obituaries will reduce their complicated, rich lives to this massive political mistake. So I'm afraid I won't share your optimism. I think it's...
In responding to you, I'm finding it fascinating. And thank you for being that honesty, because that's really, we're working with whistleblowers. That's why saying that, the truth will set you free, but first it's going to make you very uncomfortable, anxious, and all the rest. And that if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, well, then it's not true. Because it's all about your own set of presuppositions and biases. I certainly agree with you wholeheartedly. The disillusionment I felt after democracy and the wholesale abandonment of the RDP. I really was so excited about the RDP, particularly since, in terms of my own sort of like timeline of my own professional work as a social worker, just prior to the 94 elections, South African Council of Churches hosted Manfred Max Neef, a Chilean barefoot economist, to come to South Africa. And he came eagerly, and we had some fascinating workshops there, and we established a network called the Network for Human Scale Development, which embodied everything that you talked about of what real democracy is. It was about participatory democracy rather than just representative democracy, that he actually came here at the very time that he was actually a candidate for the Chilean presidential elections. And he knew that he was never going to succeed, and he didn't want to succeed. He was a very reluctant politician, but he did it to try and enrich the discourse and the debate around economics, because he felt that it actually polarized into two very grossly oversimplified binary type logics of economics and democracy. So we were very excited because we thought that his thinking would then become the means of implementing the RDP vision of a people-driven, development, et cetera, And then, of course, the whole thing was abandoned and very disillusioning for me. However, I then got myself very involved with the Amadiba community on the Wild Coast. And despite all my deep sense of dread and disillusionment after I'd come back from my work in the World Health Organization, traveling around Africa and seeing the devastation and all the rest that was happening supposedly from natural disasters, and there was nothing particularly natural about them. They were all basically consequences of policy decisions made. Found that, notwithstanding everything to the contrary, the Amadiba were able to use our Bill of Rights and our Constitution to extraordinary effect, to the point where they have not only managed to get the mining rights revoked, and a court judgment that has insisted on their free, prior, and informed consent. They've also stopped Shell from basically doing their seismic exploration on the coast. It takes me by surprise. If you ask me, how did it do it? And people look to me for the silver bullet and say, what was it that you did? I said, well, it wasn't anything that I did. All we did is practiced something of that sort of idea of people being protagonists of their own development process rather than passive recipients, and people that are there at the mercy of handouts and charity and state, pensions and what. I was very helped in that with people like Norman Reynolds and all those sorts of folk who really did think genuinely in terms of alternatives. So I'm with you there, and I'm encouraged to how you give that analysis, because it sort of confirms my own sort of sense of, that was worthwhile with the benefit of hindsight. However, when it comes to the present, and this is where I want to challenge you a little bit, because there's sounds a little bit conspiratorial about what you're suggesting. If one thing I've learned from working with my whistleblower clients and other people, and also in my own self, is our propensity to try and find a conspiracy that actually which we internalize, and then it gives us a bias, and we only judge all reality in terms of that lens of some sort of grand conspiracy. I've just challenged me, because part of the success that we had with regards to insofar as I had a contribution to make on the Kolobeni thing, was engaging the powers. Not simply naming and unmasking them, but actually engaging them and testing my assumptions about what actually would motivate them. And we've now, as you know, we've won this constitutional court case, which has outlawed slap suits. The one person that was the people that were most helpful to me in knowing what was going on with our plaintiffs was a former senior executive in the mining company. It was not by any means ideologically aligned with where I was coming from, but he was a decent guy, and we built a relationship, and he was, and he was able to help me understand what was going on in that power caucus that was driving this thing, to the point where the whole thing completely unraveled. They've now withdrawn all claims against us. The agreement signed. So we've got that. I've read, Michael Credo's book about Harry Oppenheimer and all the rest. And it's always so interesting when you look at history, is that sometimes things work out despite the best efforts that we make to kind of shape them. One of the credos I try and work with is that the best criticism of the bad is the practice of the better. So isn't the challenge that we need now, Richard, is for you, Mark Hayward, Mavuso Msimang, and Bernstein, everybody to sit down together in the same room and actually say, okay, let me test all the assumptions we have respectively about each other. Let's kind of suspend disbelief a little bit about any great grand conspiracy that's maybe motivating us. And let's try and see what actually we do really know, and that we all really know to be true among us. Because that's what I'm trying to do with the whistleblowers that have come to me and who have desperately retaliated against because of the thing, to say, well, rather than waiting for the state to protect you and put you into witness protection and all the rest, maybe let's try and find a way where the very person that you believe to be your greatest enemy, we've got to sit down with them or her. I don't know what will happen because you're not in control of that process yet, but something does happen, and something will happen. And even though I've got no certainty about it, it's about abandoning my control freakish tendencies that we are basically, as white males, we actually programmed from infancy to believe that we're always going to be the ones in control, and is actually going to sit back and be open to outcome rather than attached to it.
Well, of course, no one has any kind of pure truth. No political force ever realizes its possibilities or its aspirations in full. Everything is always negotiated. Everything is always a compromise. And in times of intense crisis, it becomes often very important to find common ground, to build a kind of united platform around what people agree on. I don't know. There's any number of examples, but imagine if on the eve of the ascension of Hitler to power in Germany, progressive forces were as they were, fighting with each other instead of saying, look, let's form a common anti-fascist position here. That was and would be crazy. Conspiratorial thinking is a huge problem in our society. It's given a lot of space when it shouldn't be. You were talking about the HIV thing. You get someone like Anthony Brink periodically having influence in our society and being taken seriously. It's a big problem. The whole Zuma project was organized around conspiracy theory, and it's become a global thing. Trump, it's all over the world. But the allegation of conspiracy is also used by people with power to deflect critique. So you've got to both be super careful of what is true and what is not true, or what is at least, factually defensible. And at the same time, know that for people who are habituated to power, and not only in the way that you spoke about in terms of sort of personal experience of being raised in a way, but on a global stage, critique, power is so normalized, its virtue is so normalized, that critique seems irrational. It seems like it comes from outside of the parameters of reason. I don't think that this platform is a conspiracy, but it's a plain fact that the motivating force for it is a group of white billionaires. That's a plain fact. It's a plain fact that they want to use their money to buy political influence. It's not a plain established fact that they want to have this extreme market fundamentalism as an economic policy. That's something I've been told, and I've made that clear that I'm not asserting it as an established fact. But if it is true, and I think it probably is, given who told me that, that's a real imminent like clear and present danger to society. As I said, we know what that economics does to people. You know, we know what it does to institutions. What I was saying about your raising the prospect of Van Zyl Slabbert's move from Parliament to IDASA being in some way resonant with what's happening now, and about IDASA's funding and its, it's funding from the NED and so on. That's not conspiracy theory. That's just to point out, actually, the point I was making was that in the hands of an authoritarian nationalism, there's more than enough here to say what Zanu said about the MDC. And to drive a rift in our politics that is unbridgeable, where politics becomes where there's no longer any possibility of the kind of mediation, compromise, negotiation, finding common ground you're talking about, because it's now a matter of confronting an enemy. Once you get to that point, as many societies have, I mean, even in a way, it sort of happened with, Trump in the US, but it's much worse in Zimbabwe. Once you get to that point, democracy will not survive it in this country. And I think the people who are throwing their weight and their money behind this don't understand history. They don't understand politics. They don't understand economics. That they're playing with fire here. Having said all of that, I don't question for one second your good intentions, but there is a fundamental issue here, because what is the defining problem of the modern world? Since Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, it's race. It's the split between those who are counted as fully human and those who are not. Initially, of course, in Columbus's period, it was religion was what was used to draw the line. But by the 1700s in the slave colonies, especially in Virginia, it had become drawn in terms of race. That is the fundamental thing we confront. Yes, we can get together and collaborate on a lot of things. On economics, we've got this massive youth unemployment, 60%. Anne Bernstein would have a very different view on how we resolve that to a more left-wing economist like, say, Duma Kubule. I've got no problem with putting Anne and Duma and everyone else in a room and saying, look, here's the policy instruments we have. Here are the laws that we've got to work within. Here's the money we have. What can we do? Forget about someone trying to win the debate. Forget about what the answer looks like when we get to the end, when we get to it. I'm just concerned when it comes to economics about how we produce an economy that is viable for most people in South Africa, and especially those for whom right now they're just spurned by the economy. They're not even exploited by it. They're just spurned by it. I mean, you and I, we both like this politics where ordinary people are protagonists, where it's democracy is about much more than voting. To say that the US through the NED and through organizations like IDASA pushed in a certain direction doesn't mean that explains everything. But it isn't a conspiracy. I mean, you can go and look on their website. This is what they funded. These are what the outcomes were. I mean, just all over the place. It wasn't just IDASA. There was a thing in Durban called Center for Public Participation, which was teaching people, community activists, not to be political, to be technocratic. That's what it was doing.
Well, what really is happening in this country, I just think in terms of the two approaches to history, the great man or great person theory of history versus, the tides and trends and traps. And I hear you coming from and saying, look, there's something larger than what an individual with their own particular sort of integrity, personality, and drive can achieve. And that's the whole point, in a sense, of democracy, is that it's about the people shall govern. The people shall be the agents of their own, self-determination and future, and that our Bill of Rights and everything else is meant to be there to create an environment where they can do so with freedom and without retaliation, without sort of intimidation, and without being killed, as you say. I certainly share with you your concern about whether there is some sort of way in which global, industrial military complex is basically still subtly involved. I just am reminded of, the Valley Trust, which was one of the places where I really learned a lot from John Stott, who founded it. And I remember interviewing him, and he told me, he said, the security police were snooping around wanting to know what we're doing. He says, so I went and called up the commander, spoke to them and said, listen, I would like to invite one of your senior officers to sit on our board of directors so that you don't have to come and create intrigue and suspicion. It was never taken up. But the point is, he actually called their bluff completely. He said, there's nothing that I'm wanting to try and hide from you. Maybe there's a place for that. And if we talk about inclusion, because what I'm a little bit uncomfortable with is this idea of actually finding a way in which we slice things so that we kind of create a sort of a dichotomy and a polarization, and we then start scapegoating the other side and becoming the embodiment and personification of everything that's wrong, which then makes us all feel so good about ourselves. Now, I'm not saying you're doing this, and I'm referencing what I've found so useful recently, the work of René Girard, who has written the book on mimetic desire and culture, and just helping me understand and move away from an overly materialistic, instrumental approach to understanding human motivations, to understanding that what makes us human and makes us real and connected with reality is far more than it can be, to use quote old Shakespeare, that had been dreamt up in your philosophy, Horatio. You know, there's a divinity which shapes our ends. Now, I'm speaking as somebody who is a man of faith. It goes against our sort of our own individual hubris need to be in control, to actually have that sense of surrender. But the thought occurred to me as I was reflecting this morning on a passage from Genesis, is not, and I'll just leave this as an open question, you don't have to discuss it now. And the passage is about eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Initially, we see that as the fall, but there was another way of reading that passage saying it was a threshold of consciousness that needed to be crossed. And it wasn't so much a prohibition as saying an invitation, because you're now going to experience what it means to be fully human and going to find yourself in conflict, in division, in strife, in hardship, in labor, all those sorts of things. But otherwise, you would just be a robot that has no thinking, feeling capacity, and have the capacity to love and to the beauty of literature and poetry and music and all those sorts of things. Part of my critique of our politics is that every political party, from the left to the right to the center to wherever, are all basically taking a very oversimplified view of what it means and believe that they now have the definitive truth as to what's good and bad. But
well,
maybe you want to respond to that.
You quoted Shakespeare, I'll quote Bob Dylan. Reality has always had too many heads. I mean, of course, that's true. No one has control over knowledge or over history. No one has all the answers. Anyone who doesn't enter a conversation with humility is going to be part of the problem. And in a way, that's part of the problem of how we got here, because we've had competing elites all lacking that kind of humility. You know, we've got the predatory, corrupt faction that cohered around Zuma, but we've also got the technocrats in the ANC. We've got a whole set of elites outside the ANC who have that same lack of humility, that same lack of a willingness to really listen. You know, there's a difference between entering a conversation to end it and entering a conversation to achieve some kind of mutual understanding and even growth. Nonetheless, it's a complicated thing because, yeah, of course, we all understand the psychological mechanisms by which people disavow. You know, there's different psychologists would use different terms for it, but disavow something ugly in themselves, project it onto the other in order to feel good about themselves. You know, need to be very mindful of this. We don't all know what scapegoating is. It also happens a lot in politics. You're obviously a theologian. You'll know the deep history of the scapegoat. So yes, openness to new ideas, openness to being wrong, openness to complexity, openness to talking, openness to listening is necessary. But there's a point. And where this point is, of course, is the difficult thing to assess. There's a point at which that becomes complicity or appeasement or whatever is the appropriate term in the situation. Now, the point I was making is there's a line that gets drawn. And from 1945 till now, in the West, that line was European fascism. someone who'd been part of the Nazi project was not someone outside maybe of a theological context of, but politically, there's not someone you would bring into a process and say, well, what can we learn from each other? You draw a line, it's axiomatic. I'm saying the only reason why the line isn't drawn with the US military is because it's the US military. It's because they're Western. It's because they're white. It's because their victims are not white and are not Western. And I'm saying if the roles were reversed, if an Arab or African military denied democracy to New Zealand and Belgium and killed people without consequence on a massive scale and destroyed societies, we would not consider those people as credible interlocutors. They would be way past that line. Where we draw the line, how we draw it's difficult. I'm saying there's a racial double standard. To sit down in the way that you're saying, it requires some kind of common ground. Now, on technical matters, what is the best policy in terms of import substitution? It's not difficult to assume people's good faith. There are technical issues at play. We say the outcome we want is as many good jobs for as many people as we can. How do we get there? People have different views. You can debate it. But you can't debate with people who don't accept the humanity of other people.
There's a line which has to be drawn. Yeah. I get that because, the Bill of Rights, somebody made the point that in some ways the way they put the Bill of Rights all out as they do is just all equivalent. They said there should actually be some hierarchy, and that the very first right is the right to dignity, respect for human dignity. Unless there's in a sense, right from the word go, a commitment, not just a compliance with, but a genuine value commitment to respecting the dignity of other people, then the Bill of Rights project doesn't start. And all the others just become kind of legal kind of abstractions. Another question which goes right back to what I'm a bit worried about, and I just wanted to maybe end with this one. My working with whistleblowers, I've become very conscious of this thanks to other friends of mine and analysts who are looking at corruption and criminal justice system and best practice for anti-corruption, all the rest, that our state is still in a state of capture to criminal enterprises. And that I've seen the inexplicably slow progress that's been made, that hasn't been made, shall we say, by the state in getting our Protected Disclosures Act done and having a proper legislative framework that supports them to make sure that whistleblowers don't have to basically risk their lives by actually speaking truth. My theory is the reason we've had such slow progress is because that, in the term she uses, the thugocratic machine that still basically holds onto the power levers and will obviously not want truth to be spoken because it'd be bad for business. So they're deliberately kicking the can down the road as much as they can to make sure that retard that so that they don't lose their grip. Now, that then leads me to say, well, if they are so committed to holding on to those levers, what's to stop the ANC now, that the likes of people like Mavuso Msimang and I would imagine a couple of others are also now going to follow him out of the ANC, to restrain and constrain those thugocrats who are basically going to want to rig and steal the next election? Because if it's true, and if I'm right in that intuition, we've got to redouble our efforts to make damn sure that there's proper monitoring of the elections next year to make sure that it's not stolen by corrupt interests.
Look, everyone thinks from somewhere, and many of us from multiple locations. I think from Durban. I mean, I'm here in Johannesburg, but I think from Durban. What I've seen, I'd really say since Zuma's rape trial onwards, in Durban, when you're dealing with the ANC, you are dealing with a mafia. It's ruthless. It knows exactly what it's doing. It's violent. It has no hesitation in killing. When people do kill, they're only removed when they have to be removed. This is not just something that's happening at the bottom. The complicity with it is extensive. Any underestimation of that would be extremely reckless. Innocence has its pleasures, but maturity requires that those pleasures be put aside and that reality be faced. Having said that, the ANC is not at this point, like ZANU, wholly out of that world of law and regulation and media. There is power there, and there are mechanisms there that can be used to keep people safe, to make things better. But ultimately, that cannot be a full solution. You know, to deny what you can achieve there, you were mentioning it earlier, you know, would be stupid. You can win real gains there. Usually defensive, to be, I think, clear, usually defensive gains. But ultimately, the only solution to what has happened to the ANC is political, is building a credible, democratic movement of ordinary South Africans. That means mostly African and Black South Africans, but mostly working class and poor people. That is democratic and legitimate and has the power, the popular power, to confront the ANC. Because you can win in court. What happens when a state ignores what happens in court? The court doesn't have armed forces to send out to enforce its judgment. You know, what you win in terms of when you write legislation and jurisprudence all depends on people in power accepting that. And not everyone in the ANC is willing to accept that. Some are. But there's people who would overlook that in a second. And they would do it in the language of radical nationalism. They would see it as an advance, as people in ZANU did. And they're not wrong that some of those laws are in the interest of power and privilege. The law is not a neutral thing. It never has been. It's always written as, you know, by people with power or during some point of compromise. But you see, this is where the failure is. It's one thing at this late stage in the game when we are already in crisis, when things are clearly going to get worse, for people like Hayward or Msimang to say, right, I'm going to throw in my lot with this project by white capital. I think that's going to make things worse. What we should have been doing 20 years ago is progressive people should have been working to build democratic forces outside of the ANC, rooted in ordinary people's lives and experiences and controlled by ordinary people, because that's the only real defense of democracy. You see, one of the problems with this elite discourse that's everywhere in the media, NGOs, universities, is that it has no emancipatory content. It just says corruption is bad, inefficiency is bad. Where's the emancipatory project? That's been abandoned. There's so many people who used to be progressive or left who kind of speak that consensus. You know, often, as I said twice earlier, in a way that's really anti-democratic. We should have been building an emancipatory politics outside of the ANC, which could then contest the ANC not only on the question of corruption, but also on the question of meeting people's legitimate needs for land, for housing, for dignity, for a fair share of the economy. The only way to make this democracy work is to give everyone a stake in it. Now, is this Roger Jardine project with this extreme right-wing market fundamentalist economics going to give everyone a stake in society? It isn't. Not at all. It's not going to solve any problems. Maybe what the people with the money are betting on is that their billion rand will get them enough influence in the existing parties, you know, the DA, the IFP, all of that, and some votes, and somehow they can speak to the more liberal faction of the ANC. And if the ANC goes below 50% in the next election, then the ANC will make an alliance with those parties rather than the EFF. Maybe that's what they're really aiming for, and maybe they think they can achieve that. But what we need is an emancipatory project. Middle class people can play a role in that. I mean, you know, Mark Hayward did that with the Treatment Action Campaign. There's any number of examples, but we have this systemic elitism where you wake up in the morning, you pick up your phone, you know, you scroll through the news sites. Journalists saying civil society should be doing this, not the state. What is civil society? It's NGOs, it's middle-class professionals. The majority of the people are simply excluded as political protagonists. And democracy will not survive in this country if we don't change that. It won't.
You've left me with, I mean, you're a very hard person to finish a conversation with because you're always so stimulating, and you raise another thought. I'm so pleased you've said that. because it brings us actually back to my relationship with Mavuso Msimang. The big change to my shift of my paradigm when I actually got involved with the Amadiba and discovered customary law of the Amampondo. And if you've read my book where I talk about my astonishing sense of how the Amampondo were able to basically prevail so much longer than many of the other traditional communities in South Africa, including surviving what was happening with the Mfecane and with the Shaka and the rest, was because of their radical democracy, the actual sense in which the hierarchy was never about an autocratic control. And basically, that's how we've won our case. That film that's just recently been released, and if you've seen it yet, about the Shell story, about Wild Coast Warriors, Synagogues Akulu, and that they talk about, they said, Shell just made this assumption that they know better than that we do. And, and he said, in this very kind of like infantilizing attitude they had towards these poor rural people living in poverty and mud huts, complete disregard and of their own intelligence. And I've now been so humbled by my work with them because I've seen it work. And I mention that because Mavuso Msimang has been involved together with people like Aninka Carson and others in trying to withstand the traditional courts bill, which was in fact as a capture project. People intuitively saw that that was actually probably the first institution that was targeted for capture was the indigenous and traditional leadership system, to basically repeat exactly what happened under colonial and apartheid powers of the making chiefs and kings stooges of the colonial powers. They were doing exactly the same thing. And just last week, we've had the court case, final court case in the Constitutional Court, where the Queen of the Amampondo and the Princess, Jeff Budland, I believe, has very persuasively argued that the executive has to let the Amampondo decide for themselves who they want as their traditional leader in terms of their custom and all the rest, and to basically respect their right to self-determination, which is very much a bottom-up process of subsidiarity. No decision must be taken at a high level where there's a competence to take it at a lower level. So it's that sort of organic process of a bottom-up. That gives me hope. When I'm feeling despairing, as I go down to the Wild Coast and I mingle with the people again, and you suddenly just re-enchanted. And I really do believe that there is a place for re-enchantment. And I do think that what you've helped me understand is, insofar as, in my friendship with Mavuso and others, to say, let's not allow, defeat to be snatched from the jaws of victory, potentially, by allowing those who are deeply anxious about all their capital being basically kind of put at risk, feeling they've got to take control of the democratic process. It's not democracy then. It's something else.
It's an attempt at another kind of state capture.
Yeah, it's oppression at the end of the day.
If we had been using the kind of practices you're referring to that you've seen there, and, they don't have to occur in that kind of context. I mean, people bring those practices around the liberation, consensus seeking to cities from rural areas, Amampondo people in Durban, but other people too, that can build democracy from below. Look, it's a complicated process, articulating different organizations and projects together, but it can be done. I mean, there have been and are countries in which people have built popular movements that have had the interests of the people at heart, and with all of whatever their contradictions and limits and so on, have A, made countries more democratic, and B, made most people or a lot of people better off. And that's what we should have been doing for 20 years, and we didn't do it because we succumbed to this elitism. The courts will resolve it, civil society will resolve it, voting will resolve it. That's not going to happen. The political work hasn't been done, and trying to take a shortcut like this, it really is if, we've made a few theological allusions in this conversation to deal with the devil. I'm a complete atheist. I don't believe in any of that stuff. I'm just using it metaphorically. And it's not just one that doesn't have the capacity to be emancipatory. It's also one that is going to legitimately make that corrupt nationalist faction of the ANC think that they're under attack by an alliance of local whites and possibly imperialism too. And like I said, there's a degree to which they would not be wrong about that. And that is going to have very serious consequences for democracy.
I was rather impressed with Judith February's most recent reflection in her Judith Prudence newsletter, in which she quotes an article written 3 years ago now in The Conversation by two US intellectuals, Shauna Shames and Amy Aitchison, in their book Survive and Resist, The Definitive Guide to Dystopian Politics. Quoting them, she says, "Dystopia is not a real place. It's a warning, usually about something bad the government is doing or something good it is failing to do. Actual dystopias are fictional, but real life governments can be dystopian, as in looking a lot like the fiction." I invited Judith to join this dialogue, but it was too short notice. So let me just end with a quote from her. She says, "As a doubtlessly divisive election looms in 2024, beware the xenophobes and false prophets. It will provide no respite, even as most South Africans find themselves exhausted by the end of 2023. Yet, and in South Africa, there is always a yet, as Shames and Aitchison remind us, fictional dystopias that warn of preventable futures, those warnings can help avert the actual demise of democracy. As South Africans, we understand what ails us, and we draw from a deep well of resilience daily. How else could we still be straining to create, live, find joy, and build community? Margaret Atwood, too, makes the call for putting the shoulder to the proverbial wheel. If it's open democracy, we've got some work ahead of us. We must roll up our proverbial sleeves, grab our arrows of desire, sharpen the paring knives of our wits, dedicate our swords to the pursuit of truth, strengthen our resolve, resist the serpents of false argument, hop onto our chariots of fire. But desperate times require desperate remedies, and our times are desperate. However, instead of all these chariots and swords, I'll propose something simpler. Don't panic. Think carefully, write clearly, act in good faith, repeat.
Think clearly, write clearly, act in good faith, repeat. That's a pretty good mantra.
I see it put a smile on your face. Thank you, Richard.
Well, Margaret Atwood can write, you know, no one ever questioned that.
It did, yeah, and so can you. And I'm looking forward to that book that you talked about.